to start with, let me introduce you to Peter Ventnor, right there, and Steve, over here, Hansen, and they're going to present to you right now the best practices with the API. Okay?
Cool. Thank you, Carrie. Thank you for everybody to join us in this session today. If you're here to be dazzled by machine learning and big data and even bigger data, then you're in the wrong session. Okay, so we're going to talk about some real practical stuff here. It is how to use the API and more specifically best practices around using the API. Actually, Steve will be doing most of the talking. He's the resident expert, and probably most of you know him through the forums. He answers a lot of the forums and has helped a lot of you build the solutions anyway. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go through a little bit of historic context so that you understand why the API looks the way it does today. And hopefully that sets us up to then explain what we think is the best way to use the API and also expose you to some of the future plans that we have. So a quick reminder, the Geotab platform was launched in late 2010. It didn't look like the way it looks today. So the application actually was a Windows Forms app. But what we did in 2010 is we hosted it in our own cloud for you. So people no longer had to install it. It may not be known to you, but the product actually existed for 10 years prior to that. So it was called Checkmate. So for 10 years, it was kind of a client-server app. And then we moved it to the cloud in 2010. This was before massive cloud adoption. So before you had just Google Cloud, you can just spin up virtual machines for virtually nothing, and Azure and all those good things. So we built our own infrastructure. It was before kind of REST APIs became the de facto standards for interacting with applications. And certainly, the security landscape was a very different place back then. So one of the things that was also different is many companies didn't have an API. So if you had a telematics system, there was just no ways you can get the data out of it. And for those who did have an API, you typically had to pay for it. So when we transitioned away from this kind of Windows Forms-based application to a web application, we used that opportunity to completely reinvent the API. And our strategy was, let's build an API that the Geotab application itself uses, so there's not two things. The API that you use in your applications is the same one that we use for the front end. Why would we have kind of a duplication of logic there? One of the key things was, let's make it open and documented. We wanted to put it in the hands of our customers. So as we were working through developing this API, we added documentation to everything. We made it part of the build process. And we put it on the website and say, if you want to know how to get access to the data, just take a look at the documentation, and off you go. You get access to everything by default. So instead of saying, hey, you can get access to GPS, but you can't get access to the other data, we decided when a customer subscribes, it's their data. We need to make it as easy as possible to give them everything. Vehicle management, maintenance, GPS information, status data, the whole lot. And you don't pay extra to get it. It's your data. We just make it easy for you to get access to it. So this enabled automation and integration. And a lot of partners, I see a lot of the tags, got interested. But they wanted more. They wanted to be able to extend our user interface and not only consume the API, but actually add features into the product that maybe we weren't prepared to build, or maybe we just couldn't build in a way that satisfies the market. So the idea of an add-in got created. So it's an add-in where you can go and extend the functionality straight within the user interface. But still, add-ins on their own are not discoverable. How would you even know that there's an add-in that exists? And from there, the marketplace was born. So marketplace being a centralized repository where you can go and discover, hey, there is a solution that uses cameras, and I can now install it into my application, and now you can extend the functionality like that. So overall, I think it's been a huge success. Right now, there's over 76 official marketplace partners. It's worth noting that Geotab's pretty particular about the partners. We don't simply accept anybody that wants to build something. And there's over 200 solutions right now on the marketplace. And of course, these are revenue drivers for those partners. In addition, to providing a solution, why would you build it if you can make money out of it? So there's a revenue stream that gets created by the marketplace. Now, there's many, many more integrations than the 200 on the marketplace, because many customers have created their own integrations and automations, and they don't feature on the marketplace. These are just things that they've built to automate their systems. So to give a little bit of credibility to this kind of incredible adoption, this is a graph for 1 week's worth of API calls between the 8th and the 15th of December. So we get approximately 1.6 billion API calls per day. Now, to put that into context, that is about 20,000 API calls per second if you spread that equally across a 24-hour period. So as you can imagine, that is an insane volume of requests that come to our infrastructure that we need to respond to. And that's pretty much half my job, is to make sure we can get this stuff to scale and keep the whole system up. But we've got a very sound architecture, and we've got thousands of physical virtual machines running in the cloud that support this kind of volume of APIs. So just a couple of other things we're thinking about. So as I mentioned, some of the decisions that we've made was born 10 years ago, before there was such a thing as OAuth and REST was popular and so on. So we settled on a protocol called JSON RPC, which is actually very similar to REST, except the way that you kind of interact, the way you structure the call is slightly different. But we recognize that the model of using a username and password and getting back a session ID is really not ideal. Like, there should be better ways of getting your token to interact with the system. So we're working on adding OAuth 2 support so that you'll be able to have a much more seamless experience, and that it's not tied to a particular user. You can grab your token using a user identity, but if your password expires or something, it's got nothing to do with the token. OpenID Connect, obviously an extension of OAuth 2, is also a way that we think single sign-on. So in addition to SAML, OpenID Connect will probably be the go-to single sign-on protocol. There's a ton of performance improvements that we're working on. For example, device status info is a very common call that you guys make to figure out, well, what is the vehicle doing right now? And we're making some improvements to the efficiency of actually gathering that information, because sometimes you need to do it often, and sometimes you need to do it for a lot of vehicles, and the response times could be slow. So we want to make that experience better for you. There are some very, very large customers where our feed that's designed to be very efficient can have some trouble keeping up. So if you have, let's say, 50,000 vehicles in one system, and you're trying to get a feed of all this information, you need to aggressively kind of call and just to keep up with the volume of data that flows in. So we're thinking of some ways in which we can make that more effective as well. Another nice feature that's coming this year is the ability to only have one URL. So today, if you go to mygeotab.com, you may have noticed that your customer's database is probably on my 526. And it may change over time, and you have to kind of keep following where this data actually resides. So we have right now essentially a reverse proxy that sits in front of the infrastructure that hides the complexity of, well, where is this database actually? And that you just go to mygeotab.com and your API interacts with that. And behind the scenes, we'll route the call to the correct server behind the scenes. So it just makes it a little bit easier on your side with not having to care about hard coding URLs. And we've seen all these mistakes. It's probably one of the best practices is don't hard code the URL. Of course, we can continue to expose some new APIs as the platform evolves. And the last one I'm putting on here, because I'm really curious, and there's a questionnaire at the end of the talk that we'll seek your feedback, is what is your take on whether it's important that we have a REST endpoint, whether the current JSON RPC endpoint is sufficient, whether we should deprecate the one and move to the other one. These are kind of questions that affects all of you. if we make a decision one way or the other. So I'd rather get your feedback before we make any specific decisions about what we want to do there. So that's a little intro from my side, and I'm going to hand over to Steve, who's going to get into some of the best practices and other things that he sees every day.
Thanks, Pete. So I'm Steve Hansen, Senior Dev Team Lead at Geotab on the SDK and Integrations team. I've been with Geotab for about 9 years, and over those 9 years, I've had the opportunity to work with the API from the front end, building UIs to building the actual APIs, building sort of separated out integrations, helping integrators with their integrations, answering questions, debugging issues, all that sort of stuff. And over that time, we've sort of come across some best practices that we wanted to share with you guys. So the first thing you want to do when you're using the API, obviously, is you want to authenticate to get yourself a session so you can make some other further calls. It's important to reuse that session over and over again and try to maximize the use out of that session. Authentication can be a fairly expensive process where we have to take that password and run hash over it many, many times for security and then compare those. So that's work that your application could be doing, which is not sort of meaningful work. It's just getting something so that you can make other requests and do that meaningful work. That session usually lasts around 14 days, at which point you could get a invalid user exception, which is just a signal to you to then re-authenticate and re-up that session ID. Obviously, with security, we want to be very careful around using what we do with passwords and sessions. If you're authenticating in some block and you have some error trapping in there, you got to be careful. If you get an HTTP exception or something, you don't want to be logging the password to your login. You don't want to expose it that way. You don't want to be, hard coding a password into some application that you're shipping. You want to make sure it's not in your Git repo or something like that. And the same kind of principle goes for session IDs. Like, it's not as dangerous, but for all intents and purposes, for that period of time that it's active, that session provides carte blanche access to that, same as that user has. So it needs to be protected as well in logging and all that sort of stuff. We encourage you to authenticate using the HTTP post method instead of HTTP get. It means that the username and password will be in the post body instead of in the query parameters of the URL. It's much easier for that to sort of leak out and escape in that URL accidentally through logging, as I mentioned, or by chance somebody had a link and it popped it into a browser bar. That would be cached by the browser and could potentially be leaked that way as well. In the credentials object, you can see there it has a database session ID and username. It's actually possible to not use session and put password in there, which means that you'd be authenticating on every request you make, which means you incur that cost of doing the authentication before we actually do that thing they're actually asking us to do, like get some devices or something. This is bad because it's using time and using resources that it doesn't need to, but also there's a limit on how many authentications you can do. So you're going to be counting towards that. I think it's like 10 per 60 seconds or something. So you'd be maxing out how many requests you could ever make to be 10 and 60 seconds, which is no good. It's something old, and we'll get rid of it at some point, but it's there for legacy reasons. After that, you probably want to be getting some information. So we have the generic get method, which you can get devices, you can get log records, that sort of thing. You can get one thing by its ID, you can get potentially all of something, or you can use a sort of discrete search with that to find something you're interested in. It's important to provide a results limit with that get request. Could be, I would say I'm probably guilty of doing this at some time, of misspelling some parameter. I say form date instead of from date, and now that from date is from the beginning of time, and now I've got to wait for my request to time out before I actually find out, like, oh yeah, what's going on here? It's my own mistake here. And if there's a results limit, then it would come back much faster and not do as much work, because the system will just carry on trying to do the best it can to do something until you eventually time out and cancel that request. The documentation has some hints around searching. So you can look at the different search objects, and they'll say, like say for instance for log record search, that using the combination of from date and device search is more efficient than saying one or the other. Some of the search objects have many searches or many parameters that you can supply, and which combinations kind of work together the most. I mean, it'll still work the other way, but it's just a little more efficient to use those combinations. And to search, if you are going to search using a date range, this is less important if you're using a results limit, but use obviously a reasonable date range. If you need data for like a year or something, maybe the feed is something you should be looking into rather than a GET request, just due to the volume of data. Another sort of just thing that came to mind was that it's a common thing to do might be get a bunch of log records back or get a bunch of status data or exceptions or something, and then you're going to put that into a report or put that on some kind of a page or something, and you want to put the device name for each one of those. The naive approach would be to just loop through each one and go get the device for each one, but there could be all of them or half of them for the same device, so you'd want to just get all the unique IDs and use that to go put them in a multi-call or something and go get them. But potentially even using some kind of temporary cache locally so that once you get it, maybe you take it for, 10 seconds, 20 seconds or something like that, and you can use that temporary cache if it's something a user is iterating over quite frequently because they don't change very often. And use some kind of reasonable timeout, so don't use an infinite timeout. Again, some misspelling or something would mean that the server is just going to go away and try to do what you're asking it to do, and then eventually it'll fail for some reason if you're trying to return too many results or something. The API wrappers generally have like a 3-minute timeout, but obviously there might be something you're doing that takes longer, and you might want some kind of a slightly longer time than that. There's the get feed method, and it's designed to supply additions and updates that are happening to something in sort of in a sort of big polling feed of the data. And it's designed to be efficient in that context. It's not going to be good if you're looking for some kind of discrete search where you want data from a date, sort of to a date. You can supply a from date to the feed, but it's really meant to be for this scenario where, say you have an integration and a new partner signs up, and you need to analyze 3 months worth of data to build that report out for them. You can seed your feed from 3 months in the past and then plow through the data into your system to generate those reports. Once you start supplying a from version to that feed method, it'll no longer even use the from date. And the to date is hard to tell from the feed because we're giving you the data as it sequentially was added. And say a device was out of coverage, but has some data it wants to send. It could be 2 days of getting data, and then we get that data when it comes back into coverage. So it's hard to know when that 2 date is going to be when they're ordered in that sequence we're trying to give them to you through the feed. And just generally searching at the feed is not the best. We had a blog post 2 or 3 years ago that sort of illustrated using a get feed with a search and using get feed with no search for status data, and instead filtering the results back on the client. So if you're interested in 10 different diagnostics, the device is reporting a whole host of diagnostics more than that. Rather than taking 10 different feeds that you're tracking all these 10 different diagnostics, you can just get the data back. The cost there is really just bandwidth. And then you can just filter out the stuff you're not interested in. It ends up being quite a bit faster. Get addresses and get coordinates are another couple common methods. Right now they accept a list of addresses or coordinates which will be geocoded. Those lists are currently unbounded, although we will add some limits in the future. This could obviously be bad if you had some 24-hour report that runs. You want to go get addresses for all the fields of those reports. And you plunk them all into one call, say there's 10,000 or 100,000 rows in your report. We're not the ones who are actually doing the geocoding. We're farming that out to some provider like Google or here.com. So it means you get the cost of going to us and then us potentially going to them. And if you have some timeout on that request for 10,000, we're busy trying to get the results from them, and then your request may time out, and we did all that work for nothing, which is no good. So generally, just limit those to sort of some smaller amount, like maybe 100 or 1,000 or whatever makes sense in sort of a time sense, rather than putting it all into a single request. I'll just pull back the curtain a little bit on what we're actually doing with some of the get addresses stuff on the server side, which will make the next point sort of a little easier to understand. And we do some temporary caching with addresses. We'll have some stuff in memory that basically just, it's just by a sequence of, a fixed set that when a new one comes in the top, it pushes one at the bottom. And the reason that caching has been effective in the past is that generally, when you want to look up an address, it's like for a report, a trips report or something, a vehicle stops somewhere like a customer. It's likely that they've stopped there before and they'll stop there again. So we can temporarily cache that to make it more efficient to look up so that we don't have to go out to a geocode provider necessarily. And eventually they come out and they get refreshed from time to time. So we found the case was that some people were getting addresses for places that a vehicle wasn't stopped, like maybe a speeding exception. And in that case, it's very unlikely that someone would ever need to look up that point again. We added this option to say, this is a moving address, or these locations are moving addresses. So don't even bother trying to cache this. I know that no one's ever going to want to look it up. And it means it doesn't make that request necessarily faster, but it may make the other requests you're making at those similar points faster, because they wouldn't necessarily get bumped out by these moving addresses out of that cache. And don't get, this kind of seems obvious probably, but don't get the address of all GPS points. I saw this recently. Someone was getting a feed of GPS data and getting a feed of exceptions and wanting to get the address of the exceptions, but was populating the address of all the GPS data they wanted to link to the exceptions before, and just don't do that. Don't do that. MultiCall is really just a batch request to the system. So you can package up a bunch of small requests, meaning you won't incur the cost of HTTP headers on those requests. They go to the server, they're executed synchronously, and then the results are returned back to you in array. This is good for like really quick calls that you need to batch together. Like a user goes to a page, you need 5 or 6 things. You can batch those up in a MultiCall, get the results back, and render the stuff on the page. It's not really good for like large or long-running requests. You don't want to put in a bunch of stuff that has a huge result set. It means you're going to get the result back, and your memory is going to blow up, and then be GC'd, which is not ideal. And also, like long-running stuff means you're just going to have to wait for the results on maybe something. You could have displayed something to the user from one of those first results in that MultiCall, and then now you're waiting on everything for that long-running one. So it's usually like quick stuff that you want to put in there. And it's important to remember that it's not transactional. So if I had 3 requests in that MultiCall to add, it means the first one may work, the second one fails, and the third one will not be executed, and then the first one is not rolled back. So it's not like a transaction in the database that's happening. Now there is some info in the exception that tells you, okay, it failed at this index, so you can handle that, and you can retry or continue on with the ones that were past the one that failed, but just something to kind of keep in mind there. Testing, as good developer citizens, we should always be testing our code. We recently released mypreview.geotab.com. This is basically like our canary federation. So it's getting builds, like really, really recent builds, much before the production federation will get them. We really encourage you guys to create a database there, potentially set up a test integration there that you have some test that runs on a 24-hour interval or something. And we try our hardest not to put any breaking changes into anything, but this can help us find stuff even earlier, which would be great. We'd really appreciate it. If something breaks there, you can quickly kind of get to us and say like, hey, this is broken. We say like, it's already being fixed, don't worry. We know about all this stuff. So I really do encourage you to create a database there. There's the API runner in the SDK docs. I use it all the time. I find it really helpful. If I have some integration or application that I need to try to make sense of the data to try to figure out what's happening in the code, you can actually go use that to get the data and look at it and inspect the data for some time interval or something similar to the app. Or even if you open the dev tools and say you need to make a multi-call in some language that doesn't have an API wrapper, it can show you kind of the structure of that post request on the network tab, sort of make it easier to construct all that stuff yourself. And there's the add-in generator. This is a tool we have to scaffold out add-ins. So basically, it's like a command line tool. It uses Node.js. You can say, like, I want to scaffold out my Geotab add-in or a Drive add-in. Puts that all out for you. It has like a local development environment so that you can sort of run and test it. You can code, and it'll automatically refresh in your browser. It offers some unit testing stuff there, so you can unit test your add-in, and some build steps, so you can build it to minify and obfuscate the code, minify images, all that kind of cool stuff. So it's a little outdated. It needs some updating. But we'll do that in the coming year, and I find it very useful for creating add-ins. Some resources. Obviously, the SDK documentation is packed full of resources. There's like the API reference in there showing you all the objects and methods you can call. There's samples. There's links to different runners in different languages. Whole host of stuff on there on the SDK documentation. We have a public GitHub account for the Geotab organization. There's a bunch of other samples in there outside of just what's in the SDK. So there's some cool stuff in there too that you might be able to discover. And of course the Geotab community, right? It's kind of like Stack Overflow or something where there's people in this room even who are answering questions in there, some kind of people who have a lot of experience with the API. Of course, we have a team of people who are answering all those questions to try to get back to you quick. And it's a great resource because the API is quite mature, and if you're having an issue, probably someone else has had that issue and had the question answered too. So I just want to touch a little bit on stuff that since Toronto, since the last Connect stuff, we've added and updated to the API. So I just handpicked a few things to talk about. So we added lots more feeds in version 1903. So something like 10 more feeds here. And these are mostly like static types, where the other feeds were for more device generated or calculated data, like GPS data or engine data. And we found that there was some systems with, say, like 2 million zones, and it was very difficult to potentially get those zones out of the system to do some kind of sync between two systems. Like you have an external system with a bunch of customers, you want to sync those nightly with the customer zones that are in my Geotab. This gives you a way to either sort of just keep that running up to date all the time, so you can check back and see that list that you have, or nightly you can feed through all the zones in a more sort of efficient way to do that. And it's also helpful for stuff like local caching of entities. So you can create sort of you could have two sort of threads, right? One that's just feeding devices and keeping its memory cache up to date, and something that's feeding log records. And then whenever you want to populate the device of that log record, you can just go to your local cache, which just has all the devices in it already. So hopefully this year we'll have a groups cache, a groups feed added. There was some recent changes we were doing to groups internally to make them more efficient. And we just want to make sure we get it right. It's a tree, right, of groups, and we want to make sure that when you get updates, you're only getting updates of the stuff that actually matter. Like maybe if this changes from this parent to this parent, then we're maybe not advertising all the children changes that happen, but just the one that actually makes sense. And as Pete alluded to, we're doing some more stuff to make device status info more efficient. And part of those changes will be to include a feed method for device status info, and that's device status info is basically the object that describes the current state of the vehicle that you might want to render on a map. You may or may not have seen this blog post earlier this year, and there was stuff on the forums and stuff about it. We introduced rate limits for the get feed method of 60 per minute, and we plan on adding more rate limits in the future. We also added results limits for these types, and they were the types that we knew no one was actually going over the limits we wanted to impose for them already. So this is a little bit of kind of like putting the toothpaste back in the tube. We have to be very, very careful we're not breaking any integrations by implementing these new limits. But we're adding more feeds so that we can add new limits to new object types, and then making sure ahead of time that we've contacted everyone who could be going over the limits that we want to impose to make sure we're not breaking anything in the future. But keep your eye out. There may be some blog posts coming soon about more stuff. A few other little changes which may be interesting to people were driver change search. You can search by type now. Zone search, we added from and to date so that you can exclude historic zones from your search. Group search, a group has a reference field, which is basically meant to be an external ID so that you can sync the group structure between two systems. So you can actually search by that reference. This was a great one for me, was adding an interface to the API object. Makes it much more testable to use that dependency inversion and mock out an API object to test your integration without actually having to make API requests. And the add-in data object, which is in preview still, no longer requires a group. It's optional. We had some people internally who were using it and had some data that they wanted everybody in the system to be able to see. And it was hard to do, like if there's someone on a leaf node and someone at the company group, how do I allow both of them to see the same data? So we just made that optional so that if you want it to be scoped, you can. If you don't, that's okay too. And there's lots of more stuff on the SDK what's new page, with lots of little details and stuff of all the things that have changed over the past 18 months or whatever it is. So here's some cool stuff here. These are some beta features. The first one is map add-ins. Neil mentioned this in his keynote, and Jason mentioned it in his talk, so I thought it would be a good opportunity to demo some of the stuff here you can do with map add-ins. Oops. Can everybody see that? Is it too small? Oh, it's okay. Too small? So the right-hand side of the map here is new. This is these are add-ins that have been made outside of the system, similar to an add-in you might see in the regular My Geotab UI. And the different tabs here, each one of these is a different add-in, separately added. And this just shows sort of, so I can zoom in or zoom out programmatically here. I could, zoom in. I could potentially save this view, and then I can move the viewport back to there. There's tooltips. So when I hover over this zone, you can see B&B Industries there. That's the tooltip for the zone. I could potentially add, a work order, a contact of the person you're at, the business you're at, and the phone number there. So now that somebody would be able to see that loaded in programmatically from your add-in to find the work order, potentially contact that business that someone's working at. And that can affect, you can apply that to zones, devices, routes, or anywhere on the map. For this one, I put a zone around Japan. So we'll just head over there. So you can see here, maybe kind of small, but you can see here there's no icons on the map there. And then I can place this G for Geotab icon on the map there using a URL, an image URL. Or I can add this other one of a light bulb using a buffer array. And those are dynamically being drawn on the map. Just head over to Australia here and zoom out. And you can see I'm drawing a polygon on the map there dynamically and adding a tooltip to it. So you can draw stuff all over the map. You can draw shapes. You can put icons on the map, say fuel stations or something like that, way stations, whatever it is that's meaningful for your add-in. The kind of neat difference between sort of the old add-ins and these add-ins is that it's more event-based, so it's more dynamic. You can see here, this is just a list of all the events that are happening while I've been moving around the map. You can see I was going in and out of a zone, the viewport moving all over the place, all that stuff. So you subscribe to events and you can dynamically react to those. You can get the current state of the browser bar here, which is really just the search state. So I can get the current state here, which says this vehicle is selected, and then I can change that. You can see now there's no vehicles selected. And if I reselect, you can see that's been advertised to me again that the vehicle is selected. And there's also the action list. So when I click on the zone, there's a list of actions that you can do. And we can programmatically add a new option to that list there. So when I click on it, it says work order, and then you could do, and this doesn't do anything when I click on it, but you get an event where you can then react to that click event and take some action based on that. So some kind of cool stuff there with the map add-ins. Be really cool to see what everybody can do with that stuff. The documentation's online, so you can find all the docs in the Geotab SDK. The next sort of new thing is media files. This is a new API for storing media. That media can be linked to drivers and devices or neither. Currently, we're starting support with MP4, GIF, JPEG, and PNG, PNG and WebP. I'll just jump into the demo for that real quick. So this is a video file that's been loaded from my Geotab. And you can see here it's only partially loaded the video. That's just the default stock HTML5 video element. We'll do that using range headers, which we support from the API. And I can play that video here. And it can be linked to a vehicle or to a driver, as I mentioned. So I'll just quickly grab a file here. I'll just use the default from Intuit, which will be now. I'll link it to a device and a driver. And you can add tags, different tags to the vehicle so you can classify, or to the media so you can classify that media. And I'll just say package and upload it. There you go. There's Picard there congratulating us on uploading a file, which we appreciate. You can see that it's linked to this device I selected, the driver, and it has that tag. So some kind of neat stuff there. Even internally, we obviously this is applicable to video integrations, but we've had some interesting ideas from the Drive team who are interested in potentially using this to take pictures of defects as they're found and stuff. So I think this can open up a lot of stuff, and we may add support for other media like PDFs and stuff like that in the future. Yeah, and we don't have any docs for this up yet. It's still pretty early with it. But if you're interested in beta testing this and maybe providing us some feedback, we've got a sign-up form here. You can plop in your email, and we'll let you know as soon as some docs are ready for that. And with that, I'm going to hand back to Peter.
Thanks, Steve. I think that is awesome. I can just see people already starting to think, upload media, I can manipulate your map, I can now do everything I actually wanted to do. And don't have to have my own map license. You piggyback off our map license, and I mean, I think I'm preaching to the choir here. You guys know what the power of these APIs will provide you with. So I mean, suppose broken record, we do want your feedback. The stuff we're doing here isn't stuff we thought of. It's things that you've asked us for. That's why we're doing this stuff. Usually, we put out in our release notes more details around changes to the API, things that's up and coming. And as Steve mentioned, look at mypreview.geotab.com. It's again something you asked for. In fact, I think it was at the previous Connect. Somebody asked, well, how do we get a preview? Well, this is how you get a preview. You now have a server, a set of servers that gets updated more frequently with the next release. And you can have your integrations running against them and raise your hand if you notice a problem or a change that we didn't detect. It's a great way for us to catch it before it makes it into production. So I think with that, we want to conclude. Thank you, everyone. I know it's late in the day, and it's the last room on the last row, and you made it all the way here, so we greatly appreciate you guys attending. We have a little bit of time, so if there's some questions, we can take them now, and we're going to hang out here for a little bit after if there's a one-on-one conversation.
Something I got bit when I was here was a server they could get updated at different times, and I wasn't able to find out. Servers get updated at different times. I wasn't able to find out just when it was going to happen, so my add-in started breaking. Is there any way for me, and it had been broken for a little bit, I should have probably detected that, but I didn't. Is there a way for me to know what version of the server I'm running against, and then I just, at that point it can alert me that you're at 21?
Yes. Okay, so if anyone didn't hear that, so the question is there a way to determine what version my server is on? Because as a new version rolls out, it's kind of unpredictable. You don't know exactly when that server is going to be updated. So the first thing is, yes, there is actually an API that you can call, and it's called getVersion. So you can call a thing called getVersion, and it will give you the kind of major, minor version and a bunch of other details. So you could certainly use that to alter behavior of your add-in. If you know there's an upcoming change and you want to alter the behavior, you can call getVersion and change that behavior. I think the preview approach will work well for this as well, so that you test your add-in against preview and that you'll know way before it gets to production. The scheduling of actual production deployments is very difficult for us to orchestrate because there's over 1,200 servers that gets updated. Some of them are literally picked randomly by a machine that does a kind of an exponential rollout. There has been some talk around the ability to get a notice that once the scheduler knows it's going to upgrade the server that you can get emailed. Nothing too concrete about that, but I'd personally try and focus our efforts on finding the problem way before you have to worry about the server being upgraded. Vishal had a question.
Yeah, the tooltips you showed some customization on hovering on the zone. How much customization is there? Like, for example, can I display an image? Can I have a table?
It's pretty limited. It's mostly just text right now. Yeah.
So, so the question was, how customizable is the little tooltip text, right? It's a question we struggled with quite a bit because the issue is if you allow just anything to be there, it also opens us up for cross-site scripting and a bunch of other stuff, right? So initially, we were kind of thinking, let's expose to you some fixed elements. So you got like a heading and a body, and there's some very limited stuff that you can do in there. We'll see how that goes. Like if you truly need to have something else, I mean, you can render on the map. You can put SVG on the map, and you can do a bunch of stuff there. Certainly on the side panel that Steve showed, you can put video there, right? So if you want some kind of more, I think the Lytics team actually showed their demonstration where they clicked on the vehicle and the side panel actually had the video piece come up, and you can click play and you can watch it straight from there. So the reality is that pop-up is also our pop-up. So it's kind of we all have to cooperate that that context menu isn't abused basically. So good question. The question is there security clearances on showing the panels? At the moment, it's not any different to any of the other add-ins. So this is a request that we receive a lot and something that we plan to address, which is how do you selectively turn add-ins on and off for specific users. And today there is no way. You can turn off the add-ins, but you can't say Peter can see this add-in and Joe can't see that add-in, right? So this is something that I think once we address that, will seamlessly fit into this. So if you don't have access to the add-in, it just doesn't appear and the tab doesn't appear. Question over there?
Plan changes for the authentication. So things like lockout policy, kicking that stuff off. For ticking that kind of stuff off, do you have any plans on doing any unlock? Because that's kind of a difficulty I've run into with
Sorry,
users.
could you repeat the first part of your question?
Sorry, the authentication part of the API, and since it's so heavily used by the front-end web UI, do you guys have any plans on putting any kind of administrative functionality like on the unlock? So when policy locks you out, can you have greater controls over that? Because right now, I don't think we have any ability to deal with administrative behavior.
So there's kind of two parts to that answer that I want to give. One is for integrations, once we have OAuth 2, it will be completely separate from the user authentication so that any kind of user lockout doesn't affect the token that you generate to interact with the API. So I think with OAuth, we will solve that problem. The second part is, do we have a way to programmatically reset a user's account? I'm not sure myself.
Yeah, I think an administrator can programmatically do it, yeah.
Okay.
With the administrator.
So in theory, an administrator, so obviously not the same user that's logged out. Somebody else should be able to call probably a set user API, right? That will reset that user's account. But I think the real problem that you're talking about is the one that we want to address. And that is that if you want an add-in or some kind of integration to talk to my Geotab, really we should be using OAuth. There should be a flow that allows you to get a token, that you have a reset token if that token expires and so on, and it's not linked to how many times did somebody call authenticate or did they forget their password and now your integration doesn't work anymore, right? Yes, sir.
Which is the best way?
Who's got the mic?
Yeah, I was going to ask a question, but you can take it.
Sorry.
Thank you. Which is the best way to get all the information for a 1500 fleet for the whole year?
Yeah, it's the feed. The feed's the way to go with that, yeah.
Okay. But by using just one get feed, or what's the best way? Because it can take a long time to have all the information.
Yeah, so it's the most effective way to get some large amount of data. So if you know you want to get up to date till now, and you know you want a whole year, just the feed will just plow through everything until you get to now, and you can just go until you get no results back, and then you know you're up to date essentially.
Okay. Thank you.
Basically, the most efficient way would be to say, I mean, even sometimes it's better to just go, depending on how much historical data there is, just start with no token and make your way through all of it. Discard the stuff that you didn't want until you hit basically no more results and you know you caught up. You can also control the frequency, right? So you could call it once every 5 seconds and let it run for a day. Usually it doesn't take that long. I mean, we limit it to 50,000 in some instances or 10,000. We've seen quite massive downloads through the feed that way. But certainly we would prefer doing that over kind of get GPS data between this data and this data and then moving it on and then calling it again and calling it again. Because that actually ends up with a much more resource-intensive query on our side to go back to the database and find this piece of data and that one, right?
So I'm a developer who was recently introduced to Geotab and the Geotab SDK, and I just wanted to experiment with it and see what I can build with it. But one of the first problems I ran into is that I can't actually play around with the API without already being a client and having a device and having a database, having data. So is there anything that exists like a sandbox to kind of help new developers get started quickly? And if not, are there any plans to build something like that?
Yeah, it's a great question. My answer is buy some devices. No, we've heard this request quite a bit, and we have a tool. So if I'm completely honest, we have a tool that we use, that our developers use, right? So there's a tool, we call it Geotab demo. You run it, and like magic, there's suddenly vehicles driving around and all sorts of stuff happening. We even, in fact, started a project that will allow us, using basically containers, to spin up a container for you that's valid for 24 hours. You can log in, you can play around, and then it destroys itself, and you get to experience what live vehicle data looks like. In all the things that you see at this conference, there's just so many other things that kind of grabbed our attention. It is something that we just haven't gotten over the line yet. But I think not just for developers, but also we hear from salespeople that want to do a demonstration. They may not have vehicles that's driving right now in their time zone. So I think there's lots of other use cases for instantaneously spinning up an instance with simulated vehicles driving around. So it's something that, watch this space. Like I say, we have it, but we need to polish it and clean it up a little bit before you guys can play with it. I think one more question on this side.
Oh, thank you. Sorry, one last question I thought of, because I might have blanked out when you talked about the media API. Are there any, once you're introducing it, it sounds like it's more or less unlimited for now. Do you guys have any plans upcoming to tie that into either device subscriptions or into limitations on that storage for your media?
There is limits, so there will be like rate limits and result limits applied to that, as well as there is like limits on size that you can upload. So a media file can only be up to 10 megabytes. So there will be sort of fairly low limits to start, and we'll expand from there based on usage.
So I think, maybe it's worthwhile talking about the use case that it was built around originally, and that is essentially in-cab video, which is typically short clips, maybe 30 seconds compressed video. While we were doing it, we thought, well, let's not just limit it to that. Let's make it possible maybe in future for documents and imagery and so on. We're exposing this to you guys because it's changing the API, and it's something we need feedback on. What we're not talking about here is kind of commercial, is there going to be some kind of fee attached to that? You guys know Geotab. Generally, we try not kind of, this API costs you extra money, right? That's usually not what we're trying to do. So we, I don't want to speak out of turn, but we haven't really covered the commercial side. We want to make sure that this API is rock solid and that you can use it for video type of applications. And for now, 10 megabytes is the limit, and of course we'll rate limit. You can't just spam the server until the wheels come off. But certainly if you're interested, sign up, and we can work on some of those questions. Okay, we're going to be here for a couple of minutes longer. If you guys want to come up to us, maybe we'll be outside, and then feel free to come chat to us. But thank you for your time and attending the session today.